11:21, 21 minutes after 11 a.m. here on July 25th, 2010. This is Doug Pagitt Radio, broadcasting live out of the Twin Cities on AM 950. And this is part two of my conversation with Krista Tippet. She is the host of a radio program called Speaking of Faith on national public radio stations around the country. And she's also the author of a book called Einstein's God. And in part two, we talk about both her radio program and the role of her book in bringing the conversation of science and religion together. So here's part two of my conversation with Krista Tippet.
Now, your book isn't just scientists. It's also religious thinkers and philosophers and others. Do you have the same work to do on that other side, saying to religious thinkers that science is important, or does that seem to come pretty easily for people?
See, I think that most of us reconcile these things in our lives without thinking too hard about it.
Sure.
Even the most devout of us, right? We wake up in the morning, we turn on our computers, we eat food that has come to us through 10 layers of science. We go to our doctor's office and we're presented with technological options, which are also moral options. We bring both of those sides of ourselves into how we look at that, how we consider it. And we don't stop to say, wow, I can't think about the ethics of this right now because it's a scientific decision. We don't. We reconcile these things intuitively. I remember somebody from Fuller Seminary saying to me a few years ago, she felt like most people grew up, and this is certainly true for me, reading about God in the Bible, learning about evolution, however sophisticated or rudimentary a way in school, and instinctively imagining that they can both be true. Also knowing that I may not be able to tie up how they're both true intellectually. That's also a bit in the realm of mystery. And I think the orthodox core of Christianity and the orthodox cores of the other great traditions compel us to take mystery seriously.
Now, your own biography, as you mentioned, you grew up in Oklahoma, right? Is it Shawnee, Oklahoma, and so you grew up in a religious family. Was your dad
my grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher.
Okay, so you come out of that kind of that kind of family, but now you're engaging in, and I think you're one of the prime voices of trying to have an interesting public conversation about religion. And for whatever reason in our world, that doesn't seem to be, there aren't very many outlets for a public conversation and public engagement with the issues of religion. It tends to be people do it in private, or they do it in clubs where people have already decided who's in and who's not in. And then you're trying to have this conversation about the meaning of religion and ethics and thought and science in a public sphere. And I know, because we've talked before, that some of the work that you did in was it in East Germany? That did that influence your thinking about saying, look, we have to have a broader sense of the public dialogue of religion? Or how did you end up pitching a radio show and now being a spokesperson for public engagement of
that was a kind of a trajectory there. There were some seeds planted in. I was living in divided Berlin. The seeds were that I was engaged in high-level politics. I was working for an ambassador who was a nuclear arms expert. This is when the world was divided up into capitalism and communism, good and evil. And I thought then that politics was really where everything happened, and that the great questions were in politics, the great solutions were political. But I saw human dynamics on both sides of that wall that drove home for me that you can have a lot of freedom, a lot of political freedom and a lot of material wealth and not have an inner life. And you can be on the other side of the wall and you can have no choice, no freedom, no wealth, and have a very rich sphere of intimacy and relationship. And so that's why I started to think there's this spiritual part of life that's just as powerful and it's under the radar. And that's when I decided to get a theological education. But I'd been a journalist there, and so I came out of seminary and couldn't see. So I had become religious again. I'd studied theology, I knew that this was intellectually thrilling and powerful and diverse. And I came out in the mid-'90s, and it was Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, and journalists who had set them up.
Right.
Not
I was
just,
gonna ask you about that,
no, there was a real collusion. They made great sound bites. They did good debates.
And
they
were
made people
sophisticated
angry.
media.
They were.
Media moguls,
and they were kind of set up not just to give an idea of who Christians are or who evangelical Christians are. They were the voice of religion. And it was poisonous. And people shut down. But I just felt then this is too important a part of life not to find some new ways to talk about it. And I thought public radio should be a place where we could innovate a new model. And we do have to innovate new models. And we have to innovate new models in all the different media. What I do on radio wouldn't necessarily work on other radio platforms or on TV, but the model that we have is of religious voices that squeeze themselves into political boxes and adversarial modes of debate, betray the spirit of their faith.
Yes.
And then rather than enriching and nourishing our public life, which is what our traditions should be doing, these become poisonous influences.
And do you? I mean, I'm making a bit of an assumption that you are one of the ambassadors of a public conversation of religion. Do you feel that way? Do you feel like that's what you're doing? And
well, I'm a journalist, so I do sense that. I think what we have modeled, we've shown that it's possible, because when we first started this program, people just couldn't believe you could do this. They said you can't have a show, have religious voices on the show talking about out of the depths of their faith, who won't be proselytizing or really turning people off or being inflammatory or exclusive. And we have just demonstrated that you can do that.
Yes. And when the show started, you were doing them once a month and sort of showing that you could put together a quality program.
This felt so risky. Felt so risky.
And did you wonder if you had 7 years worth of material? Did you wonder if you'd run out of thoughtful people at some point?
I never worried about the material. People used to always ask me that. My problem is I lay awake at night thinking of all the people we haven't gotten to yet. I probably have 100 years of shows right now, and I won't get to do them.
Is that right? Tell me a little bit about how that happens. How does a show come together for you? Where does it start? I'm sure it starts in a variety of places, but as you start working up an idea, how does it turn into a show? Like, are you on an agenda? Do you have a set of things that you've said, we want to talk about science this much and we want to talk about...
It's not a scientific process, let's say. I came into this, whenever that was in the early 2000s, with a big list. It was 3, 4, or 5 pages long, both of voices and of topics. And we've gotten through some of those, and then that big list keeps growing. And it grows because we're watching what's happening in the news. We're looking at what's being written. Our listeners suggest things. And
so you really do listen when your listeners say, here's a topic or here's a person of interest.
Yes,
that's meaningful to your team.
We really do listen.
That's Krista Tippet. She's talking about how on her show they really do listen to their listeners about what they want on the topics. A little difference between that and Doug Pagitt Radio. No, we listen to you here. In fact, a little shout out for those who are over there at the clothing swap. I know that you're listening, and we're listening to you. So congratulations. After the break, we're going to be back with part 3 of my what I think is a very interesting conversation with Krista Tippet on Doug Pagitt Radio on AM 950, the voice of Minnesota.
And now